Welcome to another Strength in Numbers podcast. I'm here with David Nir, publisher of the Down Ballot. David, I thought of a terrible, absolutely terrible dad joke for you about Texas, given the special election there.
Oh
Um,
God. And you're
and,
from Texas, so this is
and
gonna
so
be
it's going to be
truly
really
terrible.
terrible. Yep, it's about Fort Worth, so you do need context about the cattle and horse industry in Fort Worth. Okay, so David, why did nobody see the Texas special election coming?
I don't know, Elliot, why?
Because they're a bunch of naysayers.
Oh,
I know.
Jesus
It's just
Christ. Okay. I'm signing off of this podcast. We're done.
no, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Texas special election. We'll talk about also redistricting in Texas, Democrats and ICE, and we'll do a little bit on Trump and the latest election, 2020 election conspiracies, which will never die. Just I guess just like the 2020 election. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
Let's do it.
Okay. So let's start with Texas. For context, I mean, assuming everyone in this chat knows, and for context, a Democrat named Taylor Rimmet beat a Republican, Lee Wamsgans, if you know, you know, for Succession fans, in a Republican plus 17 seat or a Trump plus 17 seat for the 20 from 2024. The election was D plus 14, so you can do math. Pretty big swing. This it's also plus it's also a 10-point swing from the 2025 election in this seat. So it's a jungle primary, right? This was the runoff. The Republican candidates combined for 5 percentage points more of the vote in 2025, and now it's D plus 14. So even in the last 3 months, 2 months, there's been a 9-point swing here, which seems worth mentioning.
No,
Um,
19 point.
yes, 19 point. Thank you. Math is not my strong suit.
No.
So David, so tell us the significance of this. Tell us about the Hispanic swing, especially there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did title this episode Why Democrats Should Talk About ICE, and we certainly are going to get to that topic. That's probably going to be the number one topic of the year. But Texas had this strange special election on a Saturday. Texas does this sometimes. It's not really clear why. But Elliot and I were both up late on Saturday night publishing posts when the results came in because they were so stunning. And so you mentioned that first round, the primary on November 5, when Taylor Rimmet, the Democrat, almost won. He got just shy of 48% of the vote. And that really put the scare into the GOP. They realized something is wrong here because, like you said, Elliot, this was a Trump plus 17 district. And, look, that's just one way to look at it. This is Tarrant County, Fort Worth, the most conservative part of Tarrant County. This is a long time GOP bastion. So this is not like a Trump plus 5 area that maybe has competitive elections sometimes. It never does. In 2022, the last time this state Senate seat was on the ballot, the Republican won 60-40. So this is an area where Democrats don't have a bench. People aren't used to competitive elections at all. And you know what? The funny thing was the election wasn't competitive at all in the
Right.
end. Republicans spent millions of dollars on this seat to try to save Wamsgans and completely came up short. And it really was an interesting contrast between the two candidates. Rimmet is an Air Force veteran, a union leader, a machinist, and Wamsgans was best known for being a conservative activist. She works for a company called Patriot Mobile, which bills itself as America's only Christian conservative wireless provider.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Okay.
like who's their competition, right? Could there be another Christian conservative wireless provider? But
So the conservative Ryan Reynolds, the conservative Mint Mobile. Got it. Okay.
yes, exactly. And so, but it's not this company, Patriot Mobile and Wamsgans, led this effort in recent years to take over local school boards in the area to push Christian conservatives on these school boards and do all the crazy stuff that these far right school boards have done. And that was how she made her name. And on her website, she called herself Ultra MAGA, and she never tried to back away from that image. And it turns out that that was a real disaster. And when you have an election result like this, Elliot, I think it's fair to say, tell me if you agree, this in a seat this red, it can't just be about juicing turnout among Democrats. It also has to involve voters switching sides, and certainly some on the right staying home. And you published this piece on Saturday night late
Yeah.
asking, what's that?
I said I'm just. Oh, I was so tired. Yeah, go on.
But pro democracy results like these are really energizing. And you published this piece wondering whether this might be a sign of an incipient blue wave. And in terms of those voters changing sides, a bunch of people have done some analyses, but it looks like Latino voters in particular switched in a big way, especially those in areas closer into the city of Fort Worth. This district takes in a lot of suburbs of Fort Worth. And we've seen that phenomenon in other races as well. We saw it in the Miami mayor's race in November. We saw it in the New Jersey governor's race also in November. We've seen this over and over. And that just has to be a huge flashing warning sign for Republicans because you here's the other interesting thing, Elliot, is that Republicans didn't try to dismiss this as just some one-off weird special election.
Trump tweeted about it the day before.
Trump tweeted about it repeatedly. And afterwards, Republicans were not like, oh, this one doesn't matter. They were saying, yeah, this is a huge warning sign. And I think Latino voters may be the biggest warning sign of all.
So you're referencing this math that I did. I'll just spell this out for people who have not read yet.
Please.
So the question is, would this district have gone 32 points to the left if there was higher turnout? It was a very low turnout election. I believe about 15% of registered voters or so. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So if it was, what the midterm environment would have been, so about 70% of the previous presidential election, would it have been a 32-point swing? Probably not. If you look at the relationship between the turnout in each precinct or vote counting center and the swing away from the Republicans, then the swing is larger in places with lower turnout. But it's still too large in places with higher turnout to be explained fully by like Republicans staying home. So my best guess is if you ran this election in November with 70% of the turnout of a presidential election, it still would have swung about 10 points to the Democrats, making it a rough, like a competitive race for a good Democrat, which it turns out it seems like the Democrats recruited a good candidate there. So, yeah, so is this the case where the related question I have is, is this a case where national Democrats can learn from Remit's overperformance, or is it due to local factors like the Lee Wamsgans being a Trump mobile employee, Patriot mobile, excuse me.
Mobile.
Right. Excuse
Right.
me.
That's a funny Freudian slip there. The answer has to be both because, this is a legislative race and the stakes are always different for a state race versus a federal race. But there are so many aspects of this race that do translate because Republicans often love to nominate far right candidates like Wamscon. So she won't be the last candidate who winds up out of touch with a district that winds up shifting. And Ramet, he was certainly a very good candidate and a good fit for this district. But I think about the issues that he focused on, which are affordability and public education. And these are topics we've seen Democrats in other special elections in deep red areas also focus on. And they are very strong issues for Democrats in places like this, especially when you have Donald Trump and his top minions dismissing the idea of any kind of affordability crisis in
Right.
America. So, yeah, the other thing I want to mention, Elliot, you talked about the relatively low turnout, and turnout was also lower in the runoff versus in the first round, which is typical in races like these. But Texas state Senate districts are enormous. There are only 31 Senate districts in the entire state. And just to put that in context, there are 38 congressional districts. So these are some of the biggest legislative districts in the country. So it's not like some tiny state house district in New Hampshire where you have, 1,000 people showing up at the polls. So, yeah, I think that there definitely are lessons to be learned here. You don't want to overlearn them, though. And we'll talk about this in the second half as well. Just because Taylor Remet, didn't make ICE the centerpiece of his campaign doesn't mean that Democrats can or should ignore ICE in other races.
Yeah, notably, he did not campaign on increasing border funding for a border wall or compromising on path to citizenship, right? He just mostly ran on his local connection via his union and working for
Hmm.
the community, getting prices down, normal legislator stuff. Okay, but you mentioned congressional districts, so
Yeah.
I don't know if you've done work on this. There's I've seen some reporting about this potentially being a harbinger of a dummy mander. We talked about this, I think, last week
Yeah.
as well. So if I guess the idea is that if Texas Republicans gerrymandered the congressional seats, banking on a lot of Republican votes from Latinos, and there's this big shift left among Latinos, maybe evidenced by, evidenced partially by Romet's victory in Senate District 9. Uh, are Republicans actually going to get all of those congressional seats that they gerrymandered?
I think that is an absolutely excellent question because Texas Republicans tried to target 5 Democratic held seats, and there are at least 2 that almost certainly are going to flip. One, maybe Democrats could hang on with a very strong race, but 2 in particular were in South Texas in these heavily Latino districts with Democratic incumbents. And this is the Henry Cuellar district and the Vicente Gonzalez district. And right now, I have to say, I'd be surprised if they flipped either of those, given the trends that we just talked about with Latino voters. Now, when we talk about dummy mander, you and I have discussed this a lot on Blue Sky and Substack as well, that Republicans didn't weaken any of the seats that they hold with their new gerrymander. They only went after Democratic seats, and they made sure to shore up Republican held seats by adding in GOP turf to make sure that they didn't get any bluer. But the dummy mander question is completely separate from the possibility of a wave election where Republicans probably there's nothing they could do to shore themselves up unless they wanted to strengthen Democrats' hands in other
Hmm.
seats, if they wanted to make GOP seats redder. And that's exactly what they did after the 2020 census. Elliot, they passed a defensive gerrymander where they didn't try to go after any Democratic seats. They simply shored up Republican seats that had been vulnerable in recent years. And they didn't do that again. This time was a pure offensive, classic partisan gerrymander. But that means that in a big wave year, which could potentially happen, as you were discussing, then yeah, all of a sudden there are several GOP seats that could come into play. And I would be surprised if any of them, possibly except for the 15th district, which is the most marginal, if any of them flip. But here's the problem: if
You
those
mean, you mean flip from D to R?
flip, well, no, flip from R to D.
Okay.
So the 15th is the most vulnerable GOP held seat in Texas, and it's still about Trump plus 15. Democrats recruited a very strong candidate there. There is a chance of that seat flipping from R to D. But even if some of these other seats, which are, let's say, in the range of Trump 15 to Trump plus 20 or so, that Republicans hold in Texas that are heavily Latino, even if they don't wind up flipping, just the fact that the possibility that they have competitive races is very bad news for Republicans because the wider the playing field expands, the more defense that Republicans are on, the harder it'll be for them to hold the House, which is already a very tough task.
So what would make it a dummy mander then? So if so they've gone after 5 seats. You say 2 are very likely or almost certain to flip, I think were your words.
Yeah.
Um, so there's 3 in question. So would it be a dummy mander if those 3, I'm sort of asking you a leading question. If those 3 all still go to Democrats, is that a dummy mander?
Not according to the traditional
Because
definition.
they
I
still
think
pick up 2 seats, right?
I mean, yeah,
Okay.
the idea of a dummy mander, it's a concept that people love to talk about and has very rarely reared its head in real life. And the traditional definition of that term is you get overly aggressive and greedy with a map, and it winds up backfiring, and therefore you lose seats you otherwise should have won that you already hold. That's the key thing. What Republicans did not do is they did not put any of their incumbents in further jeopardy by this new map.
Hmm.
But separate question, some of these Republican incumbents may be in further jeopardy for reasons having nothing to do with the map. And that is what's going on in the country with the Trump administration, with just general sourness among the electorate, with Latino voters switching sides. For a lot of reasons, Republicans may be vulnerable that don't have to do with changing the map.
But if they pick up these 2 seats, then
Yes.
we can start thinking about the hypotheticals nationwide. Like
Yes.
Trump had the Republicans He said he wanted 5 seats out of Texas. This kicked
Yep.
off a nationwide redistricting war in which California gets potentially 5 seats for Democrats, right? And other states, Virginia might be one of them, uh, add additional seats for Democrats. Separately, a court order in Utah already gives another seat to Democrats. So I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. You're the down ballot guy. Uh, North Carolina and Missouri also get 2 seats between them for Republicans. So they
Maybe.
maybe right. Okay, so tell us why maybe, and then I believe that leaves the final count at potentially actually D+2.
Yeah. So there's so much play in the joints here. But let's say you give Republicans 3 seats in Texas, which is what I would predict right now. And I probably would predict Democrats flipping all 5 seats that they target in California, right? So that's your D+2 at that point. North Carolina, well, the Democrat that Republicans targeted, Don Davis, he's running for reelection. He faces a very difficult task. The seat is, I think, around now Trump plus 10 or so. It was previously very evenly divided. But you can't entirely rule him out. But let's say we give Republicans that one. So you're back down to D+1. Then you got the Utah seat that you mentioned. That's back up to D+2. I hope everyone's following along here. Missouri, that is at most R+1, but Democrats in Missouri are working to put a repeal referendum, a people's veto on the ballot that would prevent the map from taking effect. And in fact, they already submitted tons and tons of signatures, far more than the legal requirement, to put that repeal referendum on the ballot. And that has the effect of pausing the map from being used at all before the vote can take place. There's a huge legal fight brewing over that. Republicans claim, no, the map is in effect right now. But I don't think candidates are actually campaigning as though they think it's in effect. So, and I think there's a very low chance that the Missouri map goes into effect. So we were at around D+2 with all that math. But then just today, Virginia Democrats say that they have agreed on a so-called 10-1 map. Virginia has 11 congressional seats. Right now, it's 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans. 10-1 map, meaning a map that would be likely to elect 10 Democrats and just 1 Republican. And if Virginia Democrats succeed in getting voters to agree to a constitutional amendment in April and then pass that map, that's another D+4. So we're looking at D+6. Elliott, that's so crazy that Trump kicked this off. Now, there is one more major state in the mix here that could come into play, and that's Florida. It's very hard to say what might happen in Florida. There's a huge fight brewing there between the Speaker of the State House, who hates Ron DeSantis, just like any normal person, and Ron DeSantis. And
What do you mean? He's a lovely guy.
is just really the most personable, warm human being. He's totally not a robot.
He's a great hang. You'd have a beer with Ron DeSantis.
Great hang. God, he has to be the worst hang in America, right?
Nightmare blunt rotation. Okay, continue. Sorry.
So it's very hard to say. Ron DeSantis wants to wait until the Supreme Court potentially rules on this case that could gut the VRA. The state legislature wants to deal with redistricting during their normal special session. I think that's enough getting into the weeds there. But Florida could wind up with no new map at all. I think, but the Latino issue is also huge there, because if Florida Republicans think they can squeeze out some more seats, well, they don't have the huge tracts of deep rural red land that Texas does. And it just becomes harder and harder to draw that map, especially if there's a Latino bounce back. So, yeah, I at this point, I can't believe I'm saying this, because this is really the first time I thought about it. I think Democrats are coming out ahead in the redistricting wars.
Yeah, what's the probability you would assign to that?
Of Democrats actually being like a net positive?
Net positive after all this is said and done.
Better than even odds. Yep.
There you go.
I mean,
okay.
because I just don't think that, because we're talking D+6 for Democrats right now. Florida Republicans simply can't do a R+6 map. That we know for a fact they cannot do. So, yeah, Democrats are coming out ahead. I'd say good odds.
Okay. Yeah, you got to write that up for your website. Let's pivot then to talking about ICE, the main segment, I guess, for today. And I will let you. I'll let you take the reins on that conversation.
Well, I want to add that if you're a paid subscriber to either Elliott's publication, Streams and Numbers, or to my site, The Down Ballot, you can ask us questions in the chat box at the bottom. Trying to keep up with those. It's sort of a very small little box on our phones. So please bear with us. But if you do have a question, please feel free to shoot it on over, and we'll try to get to it. So, Elliot, it's this is not the kind. It's too grim a topic to take a victory lap on. It's not a term that we want to use. It's too glib. But we talked about this last week, and I'm going to emphasize again. You have been more right than any other person in this space about
Terrible thing to be right about.
it's about immigration, and in particular about how Democrats should deal with the matter. And you're right; it's a terrible issue, and it's one that we shouldn't have to think about. But it's precisely that horribleness that we have seen emanate from so many Americans. Americans overall, poll after poll, have shown, and they've shown with their bodies in the streets, just how much they despise what Trump is doing with ICE in terrorizing American cities. And a lot of big name pundits said Democrats should avoid the issue. But we have seen poll after poll, including recently, a lot of numbers saying that no, people hate this stuff, and it's in Democrats' interest to actually talk about this stuff. And you pulled together a whole bunch of recent polling on this, and I think we should talk about the numbers because as we talked about last week, if you look at just the pure rawest top line of immigration, yeah, that, is maybe a 50-50 issue. But once you drill down into the specifics, it moves far in the Democrats' favor.
Yeah, and this is that classic, what we call in political science, operational versus symbolic divide. So let me break
Ooh,
that down.
yeah, I don't know
because
that.
those
So you
are
have to explain that to me.
there was some big SAT political science words. Your operational ideology is your beliefs about how the government should work in practice. The policies that are enacted, the enforcement of those policies by the executive branch, the operationalization of your overall beliefs. And your symbolic beliefs, I'm trying to hype myself up here so you guys don't get bored. Your symbolic beliefs are your beliefs about your like signals from people that you vibe with, your overall orientation toward the world, your sort of meta views, what we might call your vibes these days about government and politics and leaders. And in 2024, here's how I think this applies versus 2026. In 2024, there's a campaign for mass deportations by the Republican Party, by Donald Trump, and maybe theoretically Trump's victory is a signal that operationally, Americans supported mass deportations. But my argument is actually they only supported the symbols of that thing. Because what we've been seeing over the last 2 years is that the operationalization, the actual in practice mass deportation agenda is dramatically unpopular. And I was writing about that last March or so, that the groups that were implicated in mass deportations, especially long-term residents and residents with children that are American citizens. No one in America ever wanted to deport those people, except for your dirty 30, your most ardent Trump supporters, your MAGA base, the 30% of America who will support anything Trump proposes. So, so I think that's the basis for this conversation. And then in January and early February of 2026, the conversation jumps. We hit a tipping point because of the enforcement actions from ICE in Minneapolis, including the two, one alleged murder and another killing by ICE officers of two American citizens. And that puts us in an entirely different place now. So I have gathered the polling data, and this is all just from this week. And I will share some numbers that I think reinforce, again, this broader point that maybe once upon a time, a year and a half ago, Americans supported the symbolism of mass deportations, but currently and perhaps never supported the actual operational mass deportation. So, there are some headline numbers from Data for Progress that I think are interesting. First, the majority of Americans support impeaching Kristi Noem as leader of DHS. So that is popular with 52% of the public, a majority. And the percent of the public that wants her to stay is 36%. So there's your 30%. Firing Stephen Miller, you don't have to impeach him. He's just an employee of the president. 51% support that, and 33% want to keep him. Again, 30%. Another question from Data for Progress: should Congress withhold all DHS funds unless there are ICE reforms? That's popular with 54% of the public, 40% oppose. And that's relevant now because Congress is debating now what funding levels ICE and DHS are going to have above and beyond the One Big Beautiful Bill Act expansion of ICE deportation center funding. So right now, and this is what I'll argue in my piece tomorrow, is a good time to be highlighting these numbers if you are trying to move policy in the Democratic direction. Not to get too far in the weeds here, but the specific reforms that Democrats are proposing right now are also popular. 92% of the public supports ICE wearing body cameras at all times, not just cell phones, actual body cams. 80% support independent investigations for the recent shootings. And just to pick another one, and I'll write this all up tomorrow, uh, 66% of the public says that Trump's approach to immigration enforcement has been too strict versus 25% that support the mass deportations. So, I mean, that's a 40 percentage point delta right there. It is almost impossible to get that level of agreement among the American public today. And to get it among contested policy and really controversial policy is notable. So that's the recent polling on ICE, and I think we're in a brave new world now that a lot of people haven't really come around to. Maybe a year and a half ago, you could have argued the Democrats shouldn't talk about immigration because it was Trump's best issue. Again, I didn't agree. You definitely cannot argue that anymore with numbers this bad for the president. And now that the symbols don't matter as much anymore because we've seen what the operational policy looks like. Okay, that's my spiel. That's my spiel on ICE.
I want to add something as well, and this is a drum that I beat constantly when it comes to polling, which is that we talked about this the other week as well. I believe that these numbers not only show big spreads, but I think they conceal the intensity of belief on both sides. And we have seen with the way that Americans are putting their bodies on the line in places like the Twin Cities, and not just there, but elsewhere, that there is an incredible anger and an incredible intensity of feeling on the part of those who oppose these measures. And I think it's safe to say that that is not matched on the other side. And the reason why I say this is, I've seen a few comments from Republicans lately saying, where are the mass demonstrations or the big protests in the streets for Lake and Riley or for freedom in Venezuela? And they don't seem to realize that's a huge self-own. Okay, where are your people then? Where are the huge rallies of conservatives in support of these things? And of course they don't exist because people don't feel very strongly in particular about something like whatever's going on in Venezuela. And so I think that Democrats really need to think about this as well, because for the longest time, Democrats have always believed, well, who are our voters going to vote for? The other side is just so bad. They'll have no choice but to come back to us, by election day. And I think that could be a real mistake this time, especially in Democratic primaries. I think we're going to see some Democratic incumbents lose primaries as a result of being insufficiently muscular on these types of issues, particularly around ICE and immigration, because Democrats just aren't used to understanding this level of anger.
Yeah. Yeah, there is an intensity divide in the country right now. We see this all the time in our House polling, the horse race polling for this year. Democrats, if you ask only the Americans that are most engaged, who say that they are going to vote in November without a shadow of a doubt, that's a group that's like 10 percentage points more Democratic than your average registered voter. So, there's this intensity divide, I think, is something worth paying attention to because it has these electoral effects, but also, to your point, it has like rhetorical and interpretive effects if we're crafting narratives about the world, which is, as journalists, we do. On that note, while you were speaking, I was thinking, there's just been a dramatic overreaction to Donald Trump in general, in terms of people trying to back into an approximation of what the country believes about people, about their values, their democratic values. And we can talk about democratic values here in a second. And I think we're seeing now that the commitment to democracy, to the rule of law and equal application of the law, regardless of people, is much more popular than I got the impression from mainstream news coverage right after the 2024 election. But it's a useful reminder, right? Like, we were writing about the numbers here in November. We were saying at 538, namely, when I say we, that Donald Trump's victory was one of the smallest on record in terms of the popular vote and in terms of his margin in the swing states. And Trump likes to say he won all 7 swing states. Big whoop, he only won them by a point, right? So that's not actually that large of a victory. And his electoral vote margin was also much smaller than the average electoral vote margin. And yet we got all of these takes about how the country had shifted dramatically to the right, and people, the average white American hated immigrants and whatnot. And America was on track to implement a new policy that reflected its new Trumpian morals. That was just bullshit, right? Like it was all BS. I guess we're going to have to put an explicit warning on the podcast. But it's a good reminder now not to, of like the self-own that you do when you overreact to electoral performance. And actually that sticking with the numbers and the polls on these things can keep you closer to the truth of the public opinion than trying to infer belief
Right.
based on electoral results.
I definitely have some thoughts on that, but we had a question that I thought we should address, asking why Trump's approval rating seems to be trending slightly upward, including in the 50+1 average. 50+1, by the way, in case you don't know, is Elliott's other site, a poll aggregation site. It really is best of breed. It is the only poll aggregation site you need to consult. And I say that because it's the only poll aggregation site that I consult. And the average has ticked up a little bit, but the questioner adds a really good caveat. Is this just noise?
So there's a reason why the website, why our poll aggregation has uncertainty intervals. And that is to answer your exact question. If the average line is not moving outside of the uncertainty intervals from the previous days or week, then it's noise. Like definitionally, it's noise. And you don't have to react too much. You shouldn't change your understanding of the political environment based off of a 1-point shift in Trump's approval. I believe the numbers cited where, Trump was at -18 and now he's at -16.6. Yeah, that's just noise. Namely, there's a lot of noise in polling averages. I don't want to get too far off course here, but there's a lot of noise in polling averages right now because of this dynamic and it's so frustrating to me as the modeler here. We get a lot of really high quality polling that's mostly among adults, US adults. That is the reference population for public opinion. That is theoretically who matters and who's being represented by the government. And then we get a lot of shit polls all the time among likely and registered voters, which is not necessarily a bad population. That's fine, poll those. But among the pollsters who are just putting data into the right-wing information ecosystem. These are your Rasmussen reports, your RNG research, your Neapolitan Institute pollsters, and the like. And the numbers that they release are so far out of the average, so routinely, that they're just biased and they move the averages around. And despite our best efforts to combat this, I do think this adds some noise to the average. And at some point, we have to throw up our hands and say, the average is what it is. Like, we're going to try to look at trends. Or we could exclude those pollsters. We don't exclude them because, they are generating data that seems to be real data, but it is conveniently biased. And that is just a problem with the polling averages in general. That was a great question.
And an excellent answer. I actually do want to dig into that because this is an issue that comes up sometimes with poll aggregation, which is there ever an appropriate time to exclude certain pollsters? And I'm not talking about actually totally fake numbers.
Right.
I'm saying someone who seems to be doing real polling, but maybe you should say, you know what? No, this is just garbage.
Yeah, I mean, if they are making up data, yeah, right, that's an easy call. So the reason that I try not to make too many of these decisions is because it just puts us in a very uncomfortable situation of being like the polling police and then always having to justify these decisions. Whereas, we can take a step back and we can set, the benefit of having a statistical model is we can tell the model, hey, we expect these pollsters to be 3 or 4 percentage points biased. And the model can say, okay, I take that into account when I'm generating my estimate. And then we just accept the uncertainty for what it is. I mean, in reality, a 1 percentage point difference in net approval rating, we're talking about a 0.5 percentage point difference in the approval rating for the president, is not changing anyone's view. It shouldn't change your view of the country as an observer. But it's also not changing anyone's behavior in government. So it's not the type of difference that we should pay attention that I think we should pay attention to. And that is what we're talking about here. Like if we took out all the right-leaning Republican pollsters, the trend would probably be a little more stable, but the average level would be exactly the same.
So, Elliot, I know there were a couple of other topics that you thought we might address, and I'll leave it up to you to decide which. But there were Steve Bannon's comments about basically having ICE at the polling places, and this is certainly a topic that we have talked about a bunch before, both a couple of weeks ago when we did a live stream, but also in writing and on Blue Sky. And also, maybe we might change gears, though, to talk about Americans' economic anxiety, because the economic numbers, despite what Trump and Scott Bessent try to claim, he was on Capitol Hill today testifying before Congress, the numbers don't look good.
Yeah. So let's pick. I guess we can pick up with the economic anxiety and
Yeah.
save the discussion of the electoral troubles. Those will continue. Those will unfortunately
Yes.
continue to be relevant. Look, I saw
Until
this.
morale improves.
I saw a really interesting. The beatings will continue. That's funny. I saw this interesting poll from Gallup covered in the AP by some of my friends who work there, Nick Riccardi and Lindley Sanders. Lindley, in particular, is a great polling journalist there. Covering this new worldwide Gallup survey. So Gallup did a survey pretty much in every Western country, asking adults there, not just voters, like what is your top concern? What is your top issue in the government today? How are you feeling about the trajectory of your life? How are you feeling economically satisfied? Are you like, is your personal finance situation getting better or worse? Can you pay your bills, etc.? And the findings on Gallup's website are really good, so people can look those up. But let's just talk about America, since this is an American show. According to the AP write-up, I'm just reading now, 1/3 of Americans rated politics and government as the top issue facing their country, behind only Taiwan and on par with Slovenia, Spain, and South Korea, which was, I believe, similar to the percent of Americans who say the economy was their number one issue. And let me connect these two. So another good quote from the AP story is from my friend Brendan Nyan, the political science professor, where he says, a world where people aren't optimistic about their economic futures is one where they're willing to destabilize institutions, democratic institutions. I think he means even further. And I thought that this was just an interesting tying together. I also thought it was interesting that it was sort of in the AP, a notable August news publication, where people are worried about both of these things, and we're receiving, the theory that if people are worried about their economics, then they might be willing to sacrifice their democratic institutions, which they are already worried about anyway. And does this not just remind you of the debate we were having about Donald Trump in 2024? I mean, that is exactly what the stakes of that election were. You had basically a recovery from like the worst economic situation since the Great Recession under Biden. He was dealt a really bad hand. Supply chain issues created inflation that he got blamed for. There was some excess inflation from monetary policy, and people and pundits said, things are getting better under Biden. You could stick with the Democrats and the trend will probably continue and things will go better. Or you can sacrifice your institutions, your democratic institutions, for economic returns, presumably from the president who had economic growth in 2019, that he can take full credit over without taking any blame for economic sagginess now. So I think it's interesting. We're in this situation where people talk about their economic anxiety still all of the time, but it has a relationship to your political anxiety as well. I thought that was a good survey from them. I don't know if you have a reaction to this.
Yeah, I sort of think that we're in a way reaching the logical endgame of a certain type of reactionary public policy that has been the mission of the wealthy interests for many, many decades. which is that you immiserate society by cutting off wage growth and making life more expensive. And you do this for decades and decades of stagnant wages and people feeling like they're falling behind. And then the reward that you reap is a decaying a country in the sense of decaying in terms of its democratic institutions. And I think that I don't know if you go back in time to 1970 and look at the things that big business conservatives were pushing in terms of the policies that wound up increasing uh, economic inequality over the ensuing half century plus. If you go back in time then and say, like, you're going to wind up yielding an environment where folks feel less attached to the democratic institutions that have kept them safe for so many years. I don't know if people would laugh that off if anyone even made that sort of prediction. And also, we have seen similar, right-wing populist reactionary movements in other countries that haven't pursued the same policies as the United States. So, in Europe in particular, but elsewhere as well. So, yeah, I don't know really how far you can trace this back, but it does feel like, the chickens are coming home to roost here.
I hate to bring up the philosophers because who likes when you do that? But I mean, we can talk about post-materialism here, or post-material politics. Ron Inglehart, I think he's a sociologist, not an actual philosopher, had this theory that as societies became more post-material, so as material well-being was taken care of on your day-to-day basis, you have food on the table, a roof over your head, that political priorities would trend away from the economic and more toward the social. And I've been thinking about this in terms of the backlash to wokeism, let's call it. I mean, backlash here is also in scare quotes. In
As is
Donald Trump's
wokeism.
election, and as is wokeism, yes, le wokisme for the people who are listening. So I, I have written that I viewed the 2024 election as a backlash to Democrats as the incumbent party because of economic problems. And so the question that you have to ask on the opposite side of that is, if there was no inflation, do Democrats win the 2024 election? I think probably. And so also, if there was no inflation, is there a quote unquote backlash to wokeism still? Do we retain the high levels of support for DEI policies in corporations, or designations from the government and hiring practices for Black and brown people? Probably. And we should think about what the future of politics looks like in America if economic concerns are as relevant as they were in the 1970s and the 80s. I mean, this is a forecasting and narrative crafting question, but we could be at a point where the apex for social liberalism has temporarily passed, as long as Americans are focused on those higher prices, which does change how Democrats have to campaign for the next couple of elections. And it doesn't mean throwing any constituents under the bus, but it does mean that a new set of priorities are relevant to the American people. And to tie this back to the democracy thing from the Gallup poll, if you want to save democracy, it becomes even more important to satisfy the economic agenda of your constituents. That's where my head was at anyway.
So we got about a minute left, and we had a good question on a totally different topic, but I think it's worth addressing because we were talking about polling earlier, which is the polling in the Texas Senate race Democratic primary, which seems to be all over the place. The race features two main candidates, State Representative James Tallarico and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. And some polls have Tallarico up, some have Crockett up, some have the race.
Crockett's polls have Crockett up. To be clear, the internal Crockett polls have Crockett up.
But the question is, is something going on here, or is Texas primary electorate particularly hard to poll? My personal feeling is that primaries in general are very hard to poll, but right. You think that this is mostly an input issue.
There's not a whole lot of surveys yet, so I would caution a pumping of the brakes. I will look up the latest surveys now from 50plus1.news. Yes, the only poll to have Crockett significantly ahead since since Alred dropped out of the race this year, is the poll from Jasmine Crockett's campaign. The rest have Tallarico up or a tied race, which is, I think, to be expected this early. But I will note, if you add the percent for Crockett and Tallarico, you're only at 2/3 of the electorate, of the likely voters. There's still a whole third out there who are saying they're undecided. And there's a good chunk of the campaign left to run. The election is next month. That's not a whole lot of time, but people don't really pay attention to primaries until the very end. But we also, you make a good point, should not expect accuracy from polls in primary elections. The average error in a primary Senate poll is around 10 percentage points for the average poll and around 8 percentage points for the average. So you should literally expect them to be significantly wrong. You should not expect them to be accurate on average. As someone says, it depends on who shows up to vote. That is true. Yeah, by definition. Yeah, if more James Tallarico voters show up, and we don't. I'm making a joke out of it, but that's true. We don't know what it's going to be just based on the surveys. So, I wouldn't be betting on the race. It seems like, if I'm putting on my pundit hat a little more, Tallarico has earlier strength with the type of voters that typically vote in a general election. The independents, your suburban and rural white voters especially, that is not necessarily the primary constituency, though. So, and maybe we'll do another election on the primary as we get closer. I mean, especially if there's a runoff on the Republican side.
Another episode on another election on the primary. The primary is an election. You mean another episode?
Another episode.
Got it.
Well, we might have another primary because of the runoff, or another election. Yeah,
that is fair. Yeah, I think you make a really good point. We should wrap up about don't be a margin bro. We've been talking about
what's a margin bro
on the down ballot Discord. The margin bro simply looks at the gap between the two candidates in a poll and ignores the undecideds or other candidates. And the margin bro, for instance, looks at a candidate and says, "Oh my God, they're underwater. Their approval rating is underwater. They're -5." Yeah, except the top lines of the poll have 20% approval and 25% disapproval, and half of the electorate doesn't even know who this guy is.
I love this. I've never heard of margin bro. This is great. It's also a great shout out.
It was invented yesterday, this term, just to be clear.
I will take the opportunity now to plug the down ballot thing. This is great real world. What do they call this in marketing? This is just good social proof for the down ballot Discord, which you should absolutely subscribe to. If you are coming from my audience, you should go to the-downballot.com and subscribe to David and his team's Substack. They're great and basically the only high quality source of news on down ballot elections. So that is my plug for David. And if you are coming from David's audience, you really should see me posting sometimes in the down ballot Discord anyhow. But you can head on over to GElliottMorris.com and subscribe to Strength in Numbers. David, anything left from you today?
No, this was an awesome conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We had almost 400 people tune in. Really appreciate the questions. Please come next week with your additional questions. We love when you ask them. We love answering them. And thank you for tuning in and for being supporters of both of our sites.
Okay, thanks, David. Bye, everyone.